In these notes, we're going to look at how to solve some equations that are a little bit more complex than the ones that we've been doing. First of all, we're going to look at how to solve two-step equations. That's going to require that we include everything we know about one step. We're just going to do it 2 times per equation because we'll have 2 different operations to undo in order to get the value for x. Then we're going to look at how to solve some equations with distribution, so that'll be things that include parentheses. And then finally, we're going to look at how to set up and solve a few different types of word problems. Our first equation is 2t minus 5 equals negative 10. The first thing that we're always going to look at is getting rid of the constant. So in this expression, 2t minus 5, 2 is the coefficient, t is the variable, and negative 5 is my constant. So I want to start by adding 5 positives to both sides. And when I do that, this is my 0 pair. So I'm left with 2t equals negative 5. Now I have a one-step equation where I'm multiplying t by 2. So to undo that, I'm going to divide both sides by 2. So I'm left with 1t on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, I can either look at it as a fraction, negative 5 halves, or I could look at it as division, negative 5 divided by 2. If I choose to divide, I'll do 5 divided by 2 and just work that out like normal. You might need to add some decimal points with some extra zeros to bring down. So if I choose to divide, I'm going to end up with negative 2 and 5/10. If I choose to leave it as a fraction, I can just rewrite it as a mixed number instead of improper. So 2 goes into 5 twice with 1 out of 2 left over. So either of these would be acceptable answers to that problem. Once you've got your answer, you're going to go back and plug it in to make sure that it actually works. So we will be still showing our check it step, and we'll start by just copying the exact equation we started with. I'm actually just going to drag it down so we know we're starting with the same thing, and we can label the check it step. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and just use the decimal since that seems to be a little bit easier. We're going to plug in negative 2 and 5/10 in place of the variable. So we're going to multiply 2 times negative 2.5, and then we're going to subtract 5, and we need to make sure that that actually does equal negative 10. So 2 times negative 2.5 is negative 5. And then negative 5 minus 5, remember that's the same as negative 5 plus negative 5. And when I add those together, I do in fact get negative 10. And so I showed that I have the same thing on both sides, so I know my answer that I had back up here of negative 2.5 is correct. Okay, next one, negative 4p plus 9 equals negative 5. Just like before, we're going to start with canceling out the constant. This time, I'm going to either subtract 9 or add 9 negatives to each side to make a 0 pair. So I'm left with negative 4 times p equals negative 14. And then from here, I'm going to divide by negative 4 on each side. So I'm going to get positive 1p equals, and now I'm doing a negative divided by a negative, which is positive. Just like before, we can set up 14 divided by 4. So 4 goes in 3 times with 2 left over. So I can either write it as a fraction, 3 and 2/4, to simplify later, or I can bring down another digit and get the 5/10. So just like before, we have a couple ways to write our answer. We can either write 3 and 5/10, or if you want to keep it as a mixed number, 3 and 1/2. Okay, now we're ready to check the answer. So we'll label our check it step. Just like before, I'm going to copy my original equation, and in place of the variable, I'm going to substitute in 3.5. So -4 times 3.5 plus 9, we're going to check to see if that equals -5. So when I multiply 4 times 3.5, I will get -14. And then when I add 9 to -14, I do end up back at -5. So those two are equal, and I know that I have the correct answer back up here. Okay, next one, 11 equals -5x minus 2. So this time the variable is on the right-hand side. I'm still going to start by canceling out the constant first. So instead of subtracting 2, I'm going to add 2 positives to each side to make a 0 pair. So I get 13 equals -5x, and then I'm going to divide by 5. Sorry, -5 on each side. It is important that your coefficients match. So if the coefficient is negative, you're going to divide by a negative. And then just as we saw before, I can do division and do 13 divided by 5. That would come out to -2 6/10. Or I could leave it as a mixed number, and I could do -2 3/5. Either one would be acceptable. Now that we've seen the check it step a few times, I'm going to skip that just to keep the video a little bit shorter, but in your homework on tests and quizzes, be sure that you are including your check it step. Okay, next one has some decimals included, but it's going to work the same way. Just as we saw before, we're going to start with canceling out our constant. So I'm going to subtract 16 2/10 from each side. We have a 0 pair here. And two things that are important to remember. First, you have to line up your decimal points. Second, because these have different signs, I need to put the number with the bigger absolute value on top when I subtract the digits. So my answer will still be negative, but I need to set it up with the 16 2/10 on top. That will allow me to borrow so that I can do 12 minus 6. And just as we saw, it will still be negative. So 8n equals -14 6/10. And now we've got a one step where we can divide by 8 on each side. So the left-hand side is n, and now we need to figure out what 14 6/10 divided by 8 would be. So we'll set up our division box. Since I'm doing a negative divided by a positive, my answer will be negative. 18 goes into 14 one time. And then when I subtract, we'll get 6. I can bring down the next digit. 8 goes into 66. Oops, 8 times. 8 times 8 is 64. We can continue dividing. So 8 goes into 20 twice. And we'll add one more 0. 8 goes into 40 5 times. And now we ended at 0, so we know we're done with the division part. And then in my answer, the decimal point's going to move directly up. So my final answer is -1 825 10,000ths. Okay, now we have one that includes fractions. Still works the same way as before. I'm still going to look at canceling out the constant first. So to cancel out +2, I'm going to subtract 2 from each side. So I get a 0 pair. It is important to make sure you bring down your negative. So this is going to be negative b thirds equals, and then we're just going to subtract. So negative 5 halves plus negative 2. I could rewrite it as negative 4 halves. That still equals 2. That's going to come out to negative 9 halves. Okay, now on the side with the variable, in order to cancel out the negative and dividing by 3, I'm going to multiply both sides by negative 3. Okay, so a negative times a negative is a positive, and b times 3 divided by 3 will be positive b. So our goal is always to get a positive variable. And then on the right-hand side, if it helps, you can line up your whole number over 1. And then we can multiply straight across. So negative 9 times negative 3 is positive 27, and 2 times 1 is 2. And then just as we saw before, from this point we can either change it into a mixed number or into a decimal. And if we divide 27 divided by 2, add decimal point and a 0, and 2 goes into 10 exactly 5 times. So I can either write this as 13 and 5/10 or 13 and a half. Either one would be fine as a final answer. Okay, another one with some fractions. We'll still make sure we deal with the constant first. So the side with my variable, here's the term with the variable. So I'm going to add 1/3 to each side to get rid of the constant. Okay, this time we already have common denominators. So negative 1/3 and positive 1/3 cancel. Negative 10 plus 1 is negative 9, and the denominator stays the same. Can bring down equal sign and 3/5 g. From here, I'm going to simplify negative 9/3. That really is just equal to negative 3. So now I have 3/5 times g equals negative 3. And for the next step, this is where you need to multiply by the reciprocal. So if you remember from before, I'll write that up here. The reciprocal is when you flip your fraction. So if I want to cancel out 3/5, I'm going to multiply both sides by 5/3. Okay, so again, just multiply by 5/3 on both sides. If I look just at this part that I'm trying to cancel out, that's going to equal 15 over 15, which is just equal to 1. And that was the whole point. We want to get 1g, so that's why we chose to multiply it by the reciprocal. So when we show that step, the 3's can simplify down to 1, the 5's can simplify down to 1, and we're just left with 1g, or that's just the same as g. And then on the right side, we can line up our numbers. If you want to use that same simplifying shortcut, you can. Otherwise, negative 3 times 5 is negative 15. 1 times 3 is 3. And negative 15/3, or negative 15 divided by 3, is just equal to negative 5. So our final answer is that g equals negative 5. Okay, next we have some equations with some parentheses. So this is where we want to use distribution to first expand that expression, and then it will look kind of like the two-step equations we were just working on. So if I have 6 groups of x minus 2, that's going to be 6 groups of x, which is the same as 6 times x, and then 6 times negative 2. So plus 6 times negative 2. When I combine these, that would be 6x plus negative 12, which is the same as 6x minus 12, and that's still equal to negative 18. Then from here, it's just the same as we saw before. I'm going to deal with the constant term first. So I'll add 12 to each side. That makes a 0 pair. And then we're left with 6x equals negative 6. Next, I'll divide by the coefficient. So divide by 6 on each side to get x equals negative 1. And then just since we haven't checked one in a few examples, I'll go ahead and show how to check that now, just so that you can see what it looks like with the parentheses. Okay, now that I've given myself a little bit of room, I'm going to start by copying the equation just like it started. And then in place of x, I'm going to substitute a negative 1. Everything else is going to come down exactly like it was. And then we're checking to make sure that that's actually equal to negative 18. So starting with my parentheses, negative 1 minus 2, that's the same as negative 1 plus negative 2, which is negative 3. Since there's no symbol in between the 6 and the parentheses, it means multiply. And 6 times negative 3 is negative 18. So since we got the same thing on both sides, we know we have a correct answer. Okay, next one. This time we're distributing a negative, so it works the same way. We're going to do negative 4 times m and negative 4 times positive 3. So the first term becomes negative 4m, and negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. So either minus 12 or plus negative 12, and that equals 24. Okay, just like always, we're going to cancel out the constant term first. So I'm going to add 12 to each side. So this is my 0 pair. Negative 4m equals 36. And now divide by negative 4 on each side to get m equals negative 9. And then since we've already seen how to check one of these, still check it in your homework, quizzes, tests, but I'm going to leave that part out of the video for now. Okay, and last example before we get to word problems. This one requires us to combine like terms before we actually start solving. So 12t minus 8t, those are like terms. So before I start solving, I can combine those to be 4t. Okay, and there is no constant, and so I can just start by solving my one-step equation. The correct steps would be to divide by 4 on each side. And negative 52 divided by 4 is negative 13. So that's going to be my final answer for that one. All right, next we're going to look at how to set up some word problems. I'm going to break it apart piece by piece. These are the same steps that you're going to follow when you solve these on your own. It costs $2.50 to rent bowling shoes. Each game is $2.25. If you have $9.25, you want to figure out how many games you can bowl. Anytime you're doing a word problem, the very first thing that you want to do is define your variable. When you define your variable, you're just going to pick a letter. You can choose whatever letter you want. For this one, I'm going to choose G since I'm talking about games. And you're going to pick what letter you want to use, and you're going to say what it represents. So in this example, the question says how many games. So that's what my variable is going to represent. So I can write G equals number of games. Okay, so again, look for the question, and whatever the question is asking, that will help you set up what your variable will be. Okay, now that we know what variable we're going to use and what it represents, now we can start setting up our equation. When you're setting up your equation, you're going to figure out what number is getting multiplied by your variable. So if each game is $2.25, then you're going to multiply G by $2.25. So I can write 2 and 25 hundredths multiplied by G. Okay, that's going to be everything that I'm going to spend just on the games. I also have to include my flat rate or my one-time fee, which for this one is $2.50. I'm only paying that one time. I don't have to pay that every single game that I play. So I'm just going to add in $2.50. Okay, that represents everything I'm spending on bowling. So altogether, that's going to add up to equal $9.25. Okay, so again, the coefficient is what you're spending per game, and your constant is your one-time or your flat fee. All right, now we have a two-step equation, and we can solve it just like before. So I'll start by canceling out my constant and subtract $2.50 from each side. So this is a zero pair, and I have 2 and 25 hundredths times G equals $6.75. Then just like before, we're going to divide by $2.25 on each side. So on the left-hand side, we're left with just G. And on the right-hand side, we need to do division. So a reminder on dividing decimals, top number goes inside the box, and the bottom number goes outside the box. We always want the number on the outside that we're dividing by to be a whole number, so I'm going to slide my decimal over twice. I'm really multiplying by 100. And if I do that on the outside, I'm going to do the same thing on the inside. So now I've turned it into 675 divided by 225. That'll give me the same answer as my other equation. And when I divide, 225 goes in exactly 3 times. So I get a value of G equals 3. Now, since this is a word problem, I have to make sure that I include units on my answer. And when I say units, I just mean tell me what 3 represents. If I go back and look at my variable, G represents number of games, so those are the units that I'm going to put onto my answer. So final answer, G equals 3 games. All right, next one. A cell phone company charges a monthly fee plus 25 cents per text message. The monthly fee is $30. That's your one-time fee you pay each month, and you owe $59.50. We want to figure out how many text messages you had for that billing cycle. Okay, just like before, we're going to start by identifying the variable. Our question says how many text messages, so that tells us what to use for our variable. So I'm going to do T equals number of texts. And now I'm ready to set up my equation. Since each text is 25 cents, my coefficient in front of my variable is going to be 25 hundredths. So I'll do 25 hundredths T. And then we have our monthly fee, or our constant, of $30. And altogether, that's going to equal a total of $59.50. Okay, let's start by subtracting the constant from each side. So here is our zero pair, and we're left with 25 hundredths t equals $29.50. So next step is to divide both sides by 25 hundredths, and that will give positive t on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we're going to do long division like we did before. $29.50 divided by 25 cents. So again, we want the number on the outside to be a whole number. So I'm going to multiply both of these by 100 so that I get 2,950 divided by 25. And then we'll do long division. 25 goes into 29 once. 25 goes into 45 once. And 25 goes in to 200 8 times. We end up at 0, so our final answer is going to be 118. And then since t represents number of texts, I'm going to put units on. So 118 texts would be my final answer. All right, last example for today. Tammy's Taxi charges a flat rate of $2.75 plus the $1.50 per mile. After taking a ride, your total is $37.25. How many miles did you travel? Okay, start by defining your variable. How many miles is our question? So I'm going to set up m equals number of miles. And then I have a flat rate of $2.75. That's my constant, it's my one-time fee. And then I'm going to add in $1.50 per mile. As a good rule of thumb, wherever you see the per mile, that tells you what you're going to multiply by your variable. So $1.50 times m. And then altogether, that's going to be $37.25. Okay, like always, we're going to subtract the constant first. So we have a zero pair, and we're left with $1.50 multiplied by n. And on the other side, we'll have to borrow. So that comes out to $34.50. So $34.50 is how much we're paying just on the mileage. And now we can divide by $1.50 on each side. Set up our long division box, $34.50 divided by $1.50. We'll multiply both numbers by 100 to make these whole numbers. And now we can just divide like normal. So 150 goes into 345 twice. And 150 would go into 450 3 times. And that'll go in exactly. So finally I get m equals 23. And for my units, m is number of miles, so this would be 23 miles. All right, so just to summarize, anytime you are doing a word problem, you're first going to set up your variable. You're going to define your variable, tell me what letter you're using, what it represents. Then you can set up your equation, and then you can solve it. And finally, you need to make sure that you include units on your final answer. All right, thank you for watching. Good luck solving equations.